Mikhail Gorbachev was the final leader of the Soviet Union and one of the defining figures of the 20th century. His presidency was one that moved away from the more restrictive communist governments that preceded him, favouring a more open and transparent government, or at least as much as is possible in a communist regime. Margaret Thatcher famously anointed him a man the West can do business with. He was viewed as an instrumental force in ending the frosty relationship between Russia and the West, which ultimately saw the collapse of the Berlin Wall, an end of the Iron Curtain, and a short-lived period where the world breathed a sigh of relief that nuclear war and war with communism might not be sparked ever again. Ironically, that also meant the end of Gorbachev's presidency. Gorbachev has passed away at the age of 91, with present and former world leaders praising him for his instrumental role in ending the Cold War. I'm delighted to be joined now by our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, to get his opinions on Gorbachev. Tony, great to see you. How are you?
I'm well, Rowan, and thanks for having me on.
So what's your main memory of Gorbachev, of his role in bringing about, I guess, the end of communism, for briefly, has it reasserted? And what would Gorbachev make of the new Marxism that we see in the West?
Rowan, we should be very grateful to Mikhail Gorbachev, because he did effectively reform communism out of existence, at least in the old Soviet Union, and for that the whole world should be immensely grateful. He started out as a kind of closet liberal, liberal communist. He then evolved into a kind of social democrat by the time he left office in 1991. But along the way, he did begin the process of dismantling communism. And very importantly, he began a process which resulted in the countries of Eastern Europe becoming free and independent. In particular, countries that had been for a long time part of the brutal Soviet dictatorship became independent democracies, in particular the Baltic states, and obviously we're very conscious of this right now, Ukraine. So while we have to lament the rise of a new authoritarianism in Russia under the dictator Putin, by the same token, there have been lasting benefits from the Gorbachev era, and just at the moment, it's very easy to appreciate what we've lost.
Tony Abbott, you famously threatened to shirt front Putin. There are many now who probably wish that you had, and that you were still there to shirt front him. What do you think Gorbachev would have made of the recent few years of Putin, and particularly the invasion of Ukraine?
He was obviously at different times an antagonist of Yeltsin, and so he was initially a supporter of Putin. It seems that his attitude towards Putin cooled. At different times he accused Putin of restoring dictatorship in Russia. On the other hand, he did seem to be in favour of a strong relationship between Russia and Ukraine. He was, I suppose, part Ukrainian himself, and I think his wife was Ukrainian. So I guess he typified the human-to-human links that have existed for centuries between Russia and Ukraine. That said, as someone who seems to have been essentially a liberal, it's hard to see how he could have done anything other than deplore the extraordinary brutality of what's currently happening with the Russian invasion. Certainly, when the Baltic states declared their independence of the Soviet Union, there was no brutal intervention by Gorbachev when he was in charge.
Tony, we can't talk about Gorbachev without talking about Reagan and Thatcher. It's a very different world now. We don't see a Thatcher in Britain, although Perhaps we might under Liz Truss, who knows? We certainly don't see a Reagan in the United States. How dangerous is the world now, both under the threat of Putin's aggression and, of course, China's aggression, which we see now, apparently the Solomons are saying no more US Navy into the Solomons.
Rowan, these are obviously ominous times. They're ominous in a way not seen for many, many, many decades. We can but hope that a Gorbachev-style figure might emerge inside the Beijing regime. No one expected Gorbachev to be the liberaliser that he turned out to be when he became the head of the Soviet Communist Party in 1985. Let's hope somewhere in the ranks of the Chinese Politburo is lurking a new Gorbachev. And look, as for the Solomon Islands, you've got to wonder whether this new ban on US warship visits is the latest manifestation of what appears to be a Chinese financial takeover, a Beijing financial takeover of the Solomon Islands government and parliament. It does seem that Chinese money has been very active in Solomon Islands politics, and this has got to be something which causes the very gravest concerns to all the democracies of the Indo-Pacific region.
We always thought when the Berlin Wall came down, which was a result of Gorbachev, that we would see Russia become, or communist countries become more liberal. Some did, others haven't. But what we didn't expect to see was basically neo-Marxism, hardcore left thinking taking off in the West. Yet that is what has happened. How can we put that genie back in the bottle? How can we get neo-Marxism out of the Western culture?
You make a fair point, Rowan. Economic Marxism collapsed in the late 1980s, but cultural Marxism is flourishing as never before, including in countries such as ours. We've got to understand that the Marxists have figured out that the workers were never going to fall for this doctrine of economic equality. But in countries like ours, the intellectuals have certainly fallen for this idea of introducing what is effectively socialism in the guise of things like environmentalism, identity politics, and so on. Now, what do we do about it? Well, we just have to expose it wherever we find it. And that's what people like you in your own way are doing, and hopefully it's what people like I'm doing as well.
Well, I guess we will see over the next couple of days at Anthony Albanese's job summit just how much strength the unions now have. We see a standoff between Dominic Perrottet and the unions. I'm glad to see Dominic Perrottet standing up to them. But what do you expect to see from the job summit? Bob Hawke and Paul Keating cut wages of the unions. We're not going to see any wage cuts, are we?
No. Look, Rowan, one of the things that I've tried to avoid as an ex-Prime Minister is a running commentary on the issues of the day. I don't think that this particular summit is really going to count for that much in 3 years' time. I think in 3 years' time, when the election comes around, what people will be looking for is, has the government delivered on the fundamental commitments it made at the election? Have electricity prices decreased and have real wages increased? Now, I think the government is going to struggle on both counts, and I think that this summit is unlikely to help the government cut power prices or increase real wages.
Now, I was disappointed when I read the list of who'd been invited to the summit, Tony Abbott, that your name wasn't on the list. However, were you to be sitting on one of the bean bags there with Albo and the rest, what would be your advice?
Well, look, that's a very good question. And again, I don't want to get too much into the detailed political commentary. The the thing that we need most of all in Australia right now is to rediscover pride in our country. Now, there are all sorts of things that could be better. There are always things that could be improved. But fundamentally, Australia is a wonderful country, and what I really dislike is the number of people who should know better, who are constantly rubbishing our history and pretending that we are in some way fundamentally racist, sexist, just to minorities and so on. The truth is, no country has been fairer to newcomers, and that's attested to by the fact that so many millions of people all around the world would love to come here and become Australians.
Tony Abbott, thanks so much for speaking to us tonight on The World According to Rowan Dean. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rowan.